Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us in our weekly study. Again, just want to mention that we will not have class next week due to the holiday week and give everybody a break, but certainly appreciate everyone who participates and listens afterwards. And just my prayer is that you will be strengthened and encouraged through all of the study here. So as you can see on your screen, we are looking at the map. We're following Samson, which is down here kind of in the middle left side, as he is judging Israel. And Samson is at least one of my favorite characters here, and it is so fun to watch what is going on here. So last week we saw that or 2 weeks ago, we saw that his marriage took a turn for the worse. They had some wedding crashers, and he ended up getting jolted and losing the wager on the riddle that he told. And again, thinking of the big picture here of this is all God orchestrating these rough encounters, if you will, with the Philistines so that he can pronounce judgment on them. But Samson obviously really didn't know and probably didn't even care because there doesn't seem to be much of a spiritual component in his life that maybe would have helped his understanding. So we see these things happening as we're going to see it continues today, that Samson has some very challenging times. So as we see Judges chapter 15, verse 1, that it came to pass after a while at the time of the wheat harvest. So this is significant, understanding that the wheat was ready to harvest, which means it wasn't green, it was dry and getting ready to be picked, but not quite ready yet, but dry enough to be very um, much a tinderbox, if you will, that this is going to play into the latter part of the story as to how Samson did something that was all dependent upon the wheat harvest being dry and burnable. So Samson went to see his wife, and came with a kid. This is a goat, obviously wanting to uh, make amends somewhat and have a party and kind of get back into things. And he was somewhat motivated. Here it says, "I will go into my wife in the chamber." So we see his motivation, and but he runs into his father-in-law who stood there and said, "Whoa, buddy, no way! I'm not going to suffer you to go into her." This is really interesting because this is not a culture of Judaism. This is the Philistine culture. Morals were very weak in those days, or very loose. There really wasn't a lot of civility, and you wonder why the father would have put up such a resistance. And he answers in verse 2 and says, "Well, I thought that you hated her, so I gave her to your best man. And here, but if you want, here's her younger sister. She's even cuter. Take her." Again, the mindset of how they treated their daughters and how women were treated, and so here's the father saying, "Well, take the younger sister, but oh, don't touch, your original wife because she's already been given to someone else." Again, you have to question why this was so important to him. So from a society, you question that a society viewpoint, but from a biblical standpoint and a God realm of looking at it and saying, okay, God's working all of this and wanting to cause friction, wanting to cause Samson to go through difficult things so that God can work through him. And again, very interesting. Part of us would say, poor Samson, he's really getting the raw end of the deal, but yet Samson's life, as we look at him, doesn't seem to have a spiritual component, uh, but we'll see a little bit of that maybe change later on. So Samson says, "Wow, am I more blameless?" This is a very interesting phrase here. "Shall I be more blameless than the Philistines, though I do them a displeasure?" This has to do with him killing these 30 guys to give them the change of garments, if you remember from the last lesson. And so he's thinking, okay, what did I do wrong here? Are you holding this against me because I did that? And then Samson does something really incredible here in verse 4 that he went and caught 300 foxes and took firebrands, which are like torches, and tied them between the tails and put a firebrand in the midst between the two. And then verse 5, he let them go, and they went running through the wheat that was ready to harvest. They went running through the corn, and they burnt, and all the fire went through and burned the corn and the vineyards and the olive groves. And obviously, this was a catastrophe for the Philistines. This was their food. People were going to starve. And so the Philistines said, "Who did this?" Now, think of what just happened. How do you catch 300 foxes? First of all, obviously, he had strength. He was able to tear a lion apart, but he was able to catch these foxes without getting bit, without getting scratched. And then while you're using your hands to tie their tails together, they obviously aren't going to like this. And then you take and braid in this firebrand, which is burning with fire, and you put it through the foxes, and they're trying to run. Um, can't even hardly imagine what this scene might have looked like, how these two foxes tied together could run in a unified manner to where they would, scatter about these firebrands. I suppose if you had taken an individual fox, you could have tied the firebrand to it, and the fox would have probably run down its hole, and the firebrand would have been extinguished. So having two of them tied together, they couldn't get down a hole, and obviously accomplished what God wanted to accomplish. But this was a miraculous thing in itself to catch 300 foxes. I- that was interesting. And then let them go. And you didn't obviously do this all at one time. You'd catch two, and then you let them go. Then you catch another two and you let them go. So this must have gone all around the countryside as he's trying to find these foxes, get them out of their holes, and allow this to happen. So that's kind of how my mind would look at it. The other way you could look at it is, did God cause something similar to Noah and the ark to happen? Remember, with Noah and the ark, God caused all of the animals to come to the ark. They stood before Noah. Noah let them in. They didn't eat one another. They were all civil with each other, and they laid down in the ark for, the 150 days until the ark was landed again. So God could have caused these 300 foxes to come in pairs, walk up to them, not scratch, not bite, not run away, let them get tied together, and he spanks them on the rear end and sends them off, and they go ahead and do this. So it's a miracle regardless how you want to think of it, that this was accomplished in such a way. So moving on there, um, the father says, take her, I pray. He says, no way. He went and set these out. Philistines obviously are very upset in verse 6, and they said, who did this? And they said, Samson. And they bring the family into it, said, son-in-law of Timnite, because this was the reason he was mad, because they took his wife and gave her to a companion, and the Philistines weren't so happy. You can imagine this was a angry crowd, and they said, "Okay, we'll give him a taste of what we just suffered," and they burnt her and her father with fire. Again, very, very difficult to comprehend. There is a little bit of this history of this word. We typically use the term that when someone loses their job, we say they got fired. There is a historical side to that, where that word came from, that was somewhat generated from this, that people used to come and burn people's houses down. And when they were displeased with them, or when they wanted them out of the way, uh, I don't know if it originated always with having to be removed from an occupation, but this is where that root word came from, and the understanding of being fired came from this, where they would burn their houses with fire, and it was called getting fired. They were getting them out of the way. And how did that get applied to a job position? Being eliminated or being removed from a job position, I don't know, but this is the basis for that word. So, a terrible end for um, Samson's wife and father-in-law. It doesn't say anything where mother-in-law was or the younger sister seemed to maybe have survived through all of this. And Samson responds, "Well, okay, I see that you're kind of helping me get restitution and judgment here, but I'm still not done yet." And so he says, after I do this one more thing, then I'm going to cease. And so verse 8, it says he smote them hip and thigh, which is makes no sense to us in English, but it is a euphemism in Hebrew, kind of where people were tipping over. We would say, you know, rear end over tea kettle is a somewhat of a term, and there's other ways to say it that I won't say during the recording. But it's rear end over tea kettle. You can see people rolling, being thrust and rolled over. Kind of fits in with this hip and thigh with a great slaughter. So you get the gist of it that he had it a strong hand against them. But then the Philistines went and pitched a tent in Judah, and they were coming against the Judahites, and they spread themselves in this place called Lehi. Now, Lehi, we're going to find out, is an interesting word because it means jawbone. So you'll see sometimes where it's translated here with the word Lehi, and other times where it'll be translated jawbone. But it appears that this name was applied after the story occurred of what we're about to read. It would be too coincidental to think that there was a place called Jawbone. They came to the Jawbone. Samson then does something with the jawbone that we're about to read about. So I think the name was given to it afterwards. So the men of Judah, verse 10, say, "Why are you coming up here?" And they said, "We want Samson. We want a revenge against him as he has done to us. And we got a lot of people who want him." So remember, this is one guy, Samson. Verse 11, 3,000 men of Judah, his brothers, so to speak, went and said to Samson, "Hey, what are you doing here? You're causing friction. You're breaking our peaceful existence." They had no clue of what God was doing. So they were railing on him for upsetting the quietness of their civilization. And and he said unto them, "As they have done to me, so I'm done to them," this was Samson's answer. And verse 12 says, "Well, we've come to bind you up that we can deliver you in the hands of the Philistines so that they don't come and kill us." And Samson said, "Well, whatever you do, just make a promise that you're not going to hurt me yourself." And they said, "Okay, easy enough. We're not going to hurt you, but we're going to tie you up. We're going to deliver you to them, and we will not kill you." So they bound him with two new cords. Interesting here is who really cares if they're new cords or old cords? The new cords have a sort of a mysticism assigned to them. Remember, people didn't have the Word of God accessible. There was a lot of superstition. There was a lot of integration of paganistic ideas, things from other cultures coming together. And so this emphasis on the description of these two new chords was somewhat of a mystical um, realm, saying that they knew that Samson had great strength. They knew that something was working in Samson's life. They didn't know it was from God. They didn't know where it came from. So they were kind of using some mystical superstition is probably a better word, using superstition based upon the culture of the day, that these two new chords would be stronger because they never were used before. So they did this. They brought him up from the rock. And verse 14, when they came to Lehi, which means jawbone, the Philistines shouted against him. But then it says that the Spirit of the Lord, you'll notice that the word Lord is spelled in all capitals. That is significant to indicate that it is the tetragrammaton, or the word Yahweh, used in Hebrew, meaning the merciful, passionate side of God, which again causes one to think of what's going to happen here. Where is God's mercy? Why was the compassionate, merciful name of God being used? The Philistines obviously didn't think this was going to be a compassionate towards them, but it was compassionate towards the Israelites. And we see God's mercy working, even though this is might be somewhat of a stretch to come to that conclusion on our own. So the Spirit of Yahweh came upon him, the cords that were upon his arms. And again, the description here is just so interesting, is as flax that was burnt with fire, and they just kind of pop coming off of him in such an easy way that he hardly had to even struggle to get out of it. And he had no weapon around about him, so he found the jawbone of a donkey. Here's where we're going to take a quick look at the Hebrew here to verse 14. We see the word Lehi being translated here is the same word that is used down here for jawbone of a donkey, lehi of a chamor, of a donkey. So this whole thing is kind of interesting, that revolving around this word jawbone, revolving around the donkey. And then it says that it is the fresh jawbone of a donkey. Well, again, why would it matter whether it's an old bone or a new bone or a fresh bone? So again, with the Hebrew, we have the ability to just take a look at this word, and we find that it is the word um, categorized as number 2961, or tari, and it's from the word fresh. But here's where it's interesting, is this is a word that's only used in the Bible twice. It's used here and it's used in Isaiah 1 and 6. Um, that always causes some interest. Why was there a special word not needing to be used anywhere else where else in the Bible, and it's applied here, having to do with the jawbone, and then in Isaiah 1 and 6. It would be interesting if you get a chance to read Isaiah 1 and 6 and see what the context is of this word, as we see only a snippet here of welts and raw wounds, and it's sometimes here translated as putrefying sores in the King James, and raw but not pressed. Again, a very interesting word. Maybe an older jawbone would be more brittle. I really don't know, but there's some significance here. So he took this jawbone, and we jump ahead, and he killed 1,000 men with it. Again, this is a supernatural event. This is ninja warrior to the max, I guess, if you want to say, of how you see in the movies of how they're able to, spin and turn and hit and defend, and that these 1,000 men who they're fighting against, who probably have swords, have shields, have spears, doesn't somebody have a bow and arrow? He's able to, knock them all down. And the only thing I can think of is if you've ever seen Star Wars with the Jedi warriors and their lightsabers, that they're able to block, bullets and all kinds of stuff that seem beyond reasonable description. That's what I see when I see Samson doing this here with this jawbone, which probably couldn't have been, a donkey's jaw is maybe a foot long, and he's wielding this thing in ways that are knocking out and killing 1,000 people. So it came to pass in verse 17 that he threw the jawbone out of his hand, which is a significant event, because verse 18 says that he was thirsty and he called upon the Lord. Here we see some interaction on a spiritual side, that he knew his thirst came, or excuse me, his strength came from God. And so when he got done in this supernatural realm of being empowered by God, he's exhausted and he's thirsty. And so he calls on God with a realm of, I'll say, faithlessness, saying, "Oh, have you brought me to this place that I did this great thing, and now I'm going to die of thirst, and they're going to come and kill me?" And again, we see this played out so many times in the Bible where God will work a miracle. It's after the fact of the miracle, and the people forget the great miracle that's done, and they complain about something that it is, of course, a basic bodily need of either hunger or thirst or shade or something like that. And Samson is doing the same thing. But then it says in verse 19, it says, God clave a hollow place that was in the jaw. So this is what's interesting. Looking at the Hebrew here in verse 19, we don't know for certain where this water came from. The Jewish people in their commentary would say that God cut out a pocket in the rock and caused water to appear there. That's where verse 19 it says, So God split the hollow place in Lehi. Well, Lehi means jawbone. So the King James said that the jawbone, he picked it up again, and God caused the water to come out of the jawbone. Again, reminiscent of God providing water for Moses and the children of Israel in the rock when he split the rock and the water came out. So we don't really know for certain. We can either be as certain that it came either out of the jawbone itself, that God split the jawbone and water came out that he could drink from, or God split the rock and caused a depression in the rock that water came in, because he wouldn't have needed a lot. You give him a gallon here and he's probably good. So he didn't really need a ton of water. And so this water could have either come squirting out of the jawbone, could have come squirting out of the rock. Either way, his spirit was revived. He drank, and then he gave the name En Hakor, which is just another word saying that this was a place in Lehi in the jawbone, and it's caused that name is still there today. And then it says he judged the Philistines for 20 years, which is, again, kind of an interesting note to put here because he's not done judging. We'll see if this gets repeated again later on. So, thanks again for joining us. Pray that you are encouraged by all of this and enjoy the next week off. And God bless you. And we'll look forward to seeing you again next time. Bye bye.